having to do with large-scale renewables, building them, building community support for them. And we try to make these spaces really sort of opening, welcoming, participative. We want to hear people's feedback and questions, what they're dealing with on the ground, what they're seeing in their towns and communities. So just quickly, everyone probably knows, but NYCP, we're a statewide collaborative campaign to rapidly shift to a clean energy economy. ACE doing that as well through different channels. But this evening, we are talking primarily about agriculture and large-scale renewables, agriculture and solar, agriculture and wind. And we have 4 wonderful speakers to speak on sort of different facets of this, I think really like exciting and sometimes controversial and sometimes, like really, potentially creative topic. So I'm going to stop talking because I'm no expert on this and I'm excited to listen in. But first up, we're going to hear from Jen Metzger, who is a former New York State Senator and former chair of the State Senate Agriculture Subcommittee, and a colleague of mine at NYCP. She is a senior policy advisor. And Jen's going to speak to us for 5 to 10 minutes on some of the stuff that she worked on, both in the Senate and things that she's working on now with regards to agriculture and large-scale renewables. Thanks, Jen. Take it away.
Thanks, Andrew. So good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here and be part of this discussion. This is such an important subject, and I want to thank all the folks who are Zooming in tonight. As Andrew mentioned, I served in the State Senate as Agriculture Chair, and in that time got to know, some of the challenges as well as opportunities for agriculture in our state. I've lived here in the Rondout Valley in Ulster County for more than 20 years. It has some of the oldest multi-generational farms in the state, and its farming is critically important to the area's history, economy, and food security, as agriculture is to New York State as a whole. And it's an industry that is on the front lines of climate change, extremely vulnerable to the impacts of global mean temperature rise, which is affecting local weather patterns and temperatures and climate. And the impacts are only going to grow worse unless we dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. New York is still very dependent on fossil fuels, the main source of climate damaging emissions. Fossil fuels, it's mostly natural gas at this point, currently account for 43% of our in-state electricity supply mix. When I was in the Senate, we set very aggressive but very necessary targets to eliminate fossil fuels from our electricity sector. New York's climate law commits the state to generating 70% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. So, that's less than 9 years from now, a very short amount of time, and to achieving an entirely free carbon-free electricity system by 2040, which is also not very far away. Reaching these targets depends largely on expanding wind and solar, as well as battery storage. And the question is really, it's not, whether we're going to expand these resources, because we don't have a choice. The question is, where and how they are sited. We have to make sure we're siting clean energy resources smartly and responsibly in relation to farmland, and also in relation to forest land and grassland and wetlands, all of which are extremely important for a host of reasons. It is challenging. I don't want to, sugarcoat it. Renewable resources, particularly solar, are more land intensive than the highly polluting resources that we have to replace. That is a fact. And, we have to do what we can to meet our clean energy goals while, keeping farmers farming and encouraging mutually beneficial solutions that support both. And there are those solutions. This past spring, I was invited by NYCERDA to participate in an agricultural technical working group that they set up to advise on essentially on responsibly siting solar with respect to agriculture. There are actually a couple of other participants in tonight's webinar that are also participating in that group, including Ethan Winter from American Farmland Trust, who you'll be hearing from very shortly, and Kyle Rabin from East New York, who is also joining us tonight. So I'm going to just use the remainder of my time to just give a brief overview of like who this group is and what it's doing. And just for context, NYCERDA is one of the main state bodies responsible for making sure that enough renewables get built in accordance with the state's renewable energy standard, which sets requirements to get us to the renewable energy targets I mentioned earlier. NYCERDA annually issues solicitations for projects to meet the required level of renewable generation and awards contracts for that energy. And in awarding these contracts, NYCERDA can take different factors into account, including impacts on agricultural and environmental resources. So let's see, Mick, if you could pull the slides up, that would be great. So the Agricultural Technical Working Group, it's a 20-member advisory group that is providing advice and guidance to help steer renewable energy development in a way, as I said, that is responsible vis-a-vis agriculture. Next slide. So the NYCERDA really sought to make this a group as broadly representative as possible of all the various stakeholders in these issues, and it definitely does have diverse perspectives, which is a good thing. It includes agricultural land preservation organizations and farmer advocacy organizations like American Farmland Trust, the Farm Bureau, and other organizations. It also includes solar developers and operators. It includes environmental and climate organizations, local government officials, especially from areas that have seen or are seeing more of the renewable development, and academic experts, and also various state agency representatives. Next slide. So we've been meeting. We've only had 3 meetings to date. We've been meeting since April, and there are the specialist committees that are, working on specific issues in between. But the main work has focused on the main project has been helping to develop a smart solar siting scorecard to encourage responsible siting of renewables on agricultural land. And we're also advising on the development of an agrivoltaic pilot program, which is, I think, really exciting. Next slide. So the smart solar siting scorecard, first, a big caveat in that this is like really just developing. So I'm just going to kind of give a broad brush overview of the approach, but the strategy, it's like a 3-point strategy, and it's like a hierarchy of of strategies. The first is avoidance. You want to, the goal is to avoid as much as possible those sensitive lands and protected lands to the degree that we can. And when it can't be avoided, it's about strategies that minimize the impact. And then lastly, you know, the strategy is to also mitigate, to address those impacts that you can't avoid. And the idea is that it will be a point-based system to essentially assess how smart a project is, with a minimum number of points to pass. And here we'll go through each of these, just give examples of the 3-point strategy. Next slide. So under the avoidance categories, we want to avoid prime agricultural soils, which are mineral soils 1 to 4. And I think Ethan will talk a little bit more about that next. We want to avoid farmland that is in active cultivation, and that is land that has been in active cultivation, sometime within the last 5 years is how it's defined. We also want to avoid forest lands and wetlands and grasslands. Next slide. So, to the extent to which, those resources cannot be avoided, the goal is to promote minimization strategies. So this could be promoting dual use, agrivoltaic projects, which we'll talk a little bit more in a moment, plantings between panels and around, installations to provide habitat, restore soil health, and sequester carbon. So taking actions that actually, improve soils. Also, with regard to, protecting sensitive environmental resources, designing in protective buffers, for instance, around wetlands. Another mitigation strategy is engaging with farmers and with the local community on local priorities and opportunities that can be designed into the project. Next slide. And then, mitigation, a possible mitigation strategy is to pay into a fund for farmland preservation. That's actually an existing mitigation strategy. Next slide. So as I said, this scorecard framework is very much in development. It would be used as a tool, likely as a tool during the solicitation process, but it's also possibly a tool for communities as well. And I think it's also an important tool in bringing, transparency to, to projects and their impacts. So the second area that we've been focusing our work on, or just started talking about actually, is an agrivoltaic incubator pilot program that NYCP is now developing. So agrivoltaics, this is about promoting co-location of, of agricultural activities with solar projects. So, for instance, you could have, animal grazing between panels. That's one that is already in use in New York, but also, growing shade-tolerant crops or other agricultural activities. This agrivoltaics has been, I think there's really been a lot more work done on this in other countries, particularly countries where land is incredibly scarce, places like Germany and Japan. And we're really just in this country, research is just getting underway, but it's very important for us to understand, the benefits of this, what kind of agricultural activities can be undertaken, co-located with solar, what the costs are. So this NYCP program will really be a research pilot to investigate these things, and it's an exciting opportunity coming down the road. Next slide. So I'm gonna stop there, but I just want to point out that there is a website for this working group where you can keep abreast of what's happening. www.nyatwg is what we call it.com, and I look forward to the discussion to follow. And we'll turn it over to Ethan Winter from AFT.
Hey,
Thank
Ethan,
you,
just,
Jen.
just
Go ahead.
before you, sorry, this is Andrew. Just before you get started, I want to remind folks, throw your questions and comments in the chat so we can start collecting them for a discussion afterwards. Ethan.
That's great. Jen is a super tee up, and I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. I always hope that this works. And can you all see my screen that has the AFT logo on top there?
Yeah.
Great. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Ethan Winter. I'm the Northeast Solar Specialist for American Farmland Trust. And I come at this work from a couple of different perspectives. I worked in community solar development for 3 years, and prior to that, I was with the Land Trust Alliance in New York, directing its program statewide. So I'm very interested in this nexus of land use, energy development, and food and agriculture. And that's a perfect opportunity for this evening's conversation. For those of you who are not super acquainted with American Farmland Trust, we're a national farmland organization established in 1980. And we have sort of 3 pillars: protecting the best farmland, keeping farmers on the land, and promoting sound farm practices. What's really interesting is, as we think about our work on climate change, of course, we're protecting farmland to grow food and ensure our food security. Climate change is impacting that every day. The sound practices and keeping farmers on the land piece is increasingly through a regenerative lens, and thinking about resilience and how we're protecting our soil health and creating best practices around, again, regenerative approaches to agriculture. Those pillars feed right into our emerging work on solar. Solar is a really nuanced and complex topic, and we're seeing, because of the scale of solar needed to decarbonize, a huge set of questions around siting on farmland, because this is typically the lowest cost and most convenient place to locate solar energy resources. So again, these are really important questions for us, and I'm going to provide just a few slides here on how we're approaching this conversation here in New York. Taking a sort of a national level, folks on this call may be quite familiar with this. I just want to flag the Department of Energy's Solar Future Study. This was released in September, and it provides a blueprint for how the country would get to 40 to 45% solar penetration by mid-century. And that is more than an order of magnitude greater generation than we have now. And in the study, there are a number of technological and other market development chapters. I think what's really interesting is looking at the land use piece. How do we sort of project the land resource needed to support this amount of solar? And the report talks about a couple different scenarios, a decarbonization light, I might call it, as well as a decarbonization plus electrification scenario. And at the higher scenario, we would need about 10 million acres of solar across the country to meet that 45% target. We have a lot of land in this country, so it's not like we don't have 10 million acres. However, if that were all on prime farmland where we're growing our food, that would be a real challenge. The study also highlighted that roughly 90% of this utility solar would occur in rural communities. So you can do the extrapolation that we're talking about farmland in large measure. And American Farmland Trust is supporting the advancement of solar, but really pushing for this to be on marginal land. And first of all, on the built environment. So we're avoiding farmland altogether. Where it is on farmland, we're encouraging it to be on less productive land. And where it is on productive land, really being smart about how we're getting co-benefits for farm viability and wherever possible with dual use, an agricultural outcome as well. And so that's something that we're going to be digging into. Jen, you provided a great kind of overview of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and our targets there. These are guiding questions for us as well at American Farmland Trust, really thinking through how much land is needed over what time frame to support New York's solar energy goals. What we know is that there's 14 to 16 gigawatts of solar in the large scale New York ISO queue. Those are the large scale projects. And there's another 1,000 to 2,000 megawatts of community solar in development as well. So by and large, the real footprint that we're looking at around solar are large scale projects in New York that are anywhere from 220 to 500 megawatts in size. The 500 megawatt project in Genesee County, which is known as Cider Solar, is the largest project, I think, in the northeastern United States. So where these projects are located really does matter, particularly when they're concentrated in particular areas. And we do see trends where they're concentrated because of available interconnection and land availability. So there are hotspots around the state here that may have a real impact on long-term agricultural viability in those areas. The map on the right is from American Farmland Trust's Farms Under Threat study, where we evaluated farmland loss in New York and all the states. And we identified 11 million acres of conversion of the best farmland across the country between 2001 and 2016. New York ranked pretty high in terms of the farmland conversion here. And you can see in red where we saw farmland loss. This was before solar. So it's just something to keep in mind that solar is another form of land use that we need to contend with. And it doesn't have to turn into red. It could very well be that we can turn land into a solar generating resource that also has an agricultural outcome. And that's something that we're very much promoting. And that leads to my kind of last guiding question here around how solar can be more compatible with agriculture, long-term farm viability in the communities where we're really talking about a significant presence of solar generation. Just to give you an example of what's in process here in New York, as New York is looking to meet its CLCPA targets. The map on the right shows a distribution of megawatts by county. And this is somewhat dated. This is from the August New York ISO queue. We identified about 14,000 megawatts in development. And the 5 counties with the most development in process had on average almost 1,000 megawatts of project in the queue. It doesn't mean that all those projects will be developed, but it means that there's a great deal of interest and work with landowners and developers to develop viable projects. Montgomery County alone has over 1,000 megawatts, and that's the dark red county right in the middle of your map. I think it also highlights where we don't have a lot of large scale solar. The Hudson Valley being sort of the obvious one here. On the left, you see a few of the cluster areas, which coincide with some of New York's most productive farmland. So again, we're seeing some really interesting examples where project developers are integrating sheep grazing, proposing manure injection between panels, and other co-utilization for these large-scale projects. And that's something we're going to be continuing to monitor as these projects are developed. My next couple of slides, I'm just going to highlight, what American Farmland Trust is kind of talking about here, some articulating our real goals as we're intersecting in this in New York. First, and to the scorecard that Jen was talking about, we're promoting the avoidance of the most productive, versatile, and resilient soils in New York. These are known resources. They can be put into a GIS, and developers can use that information to avoid and design their projects accordingly. So we're really protecting our most productive soils. In New York Ag and Markets has mineral soil groups. These are the soil classifications that the state uses. And we're really targeting soil groups 1 to 4 as being analogous to our most productive land. This is consistent with how NYCP and Ag and Markets are also classifying things with the scorecard. The most important sort of innovation that we're pushing on this is that the farmland mitigation program that the state currently has should be based on the true cost of farmland protection. And for projects that are impacting a significant portion of those mineral soil groups, there should be some kind of amplifier or multiplier to really make sure that we're getting compensatory mitigation for that farmland. Ultimately, that funding should be a revenue source for farmland protection and agricultural support in the areas that are supporting that solar. In general, again, we're highlighting that we should be supporting placement on more marginal lands where we can, and ultimately seeing farmers and the farm communities that are hosting these projects as partners, not merely as land or dirt for projects, but really the essential resource for how we're developing solar. So viability of agriculture long-term being a very important part of the context for solar development as well. Back to our earlier comment on regenerative agriculture, we'll see a lot more research here around regenerative land practices. And by that, I mean thinking about soil health, soil carbon, and land practices that can build the quality of the soil over the life of the project. This is an active process. It's not just mowing the lawn and forgetting about it. It's really thinking about how we can build soil over time so that at the end of the project, we may have better land than we started with from an agricultural standpoint. So stay tuned. I think we're going to see a lot more research around regenerative practices being a part of the industry standard for solar over time. And finally, Jen mentioned dual use and agrivoltaics. Again, this is a key area of research. We're very interested in seeing proof of concept here. If there are folks on this call who are either interested in or know about potential projects in New York, we're very interested in hearing about that and supporting them however we can. We would love to be a partner on a demonstration project that's growing food and generating solar at the same time. So keep that in mind if we've got land trusts on the call or other municipal partners who are looking for a demonstration project. We'd love to be in touch about that. One of the key considerations for how we get there is a set of market mechanisms, whether they're incentives or price signals for developers, so that dual use solar can actually be clearly modeled and developed. Massachusetts has a dual use program. It's had some problems, and so we're looking at that as more as a learning example than a model. The state of New Jersey has a dual use pilot program that's just underway right now, and we're very interested in seeing how that develops. So there are examples in nearby states where dual use is part of the market and where innovation is occurring, and we hope that New York can quickly move into that area as well. And NYCP's proposed incubator RFP is a great step in that direction. And finally, research is going to be a very important part of this, and we're excited to see more universities getting into this space, supporting research and tapping into Department of Energy funding to do field trials and see how solar and crops can be integrated. I think we'll be hearing more about that from Cornell and others as time goes on. I just wanted to flag, if you're interested in this, there's a brand new national clearinghouse. It's called the Agri-Solar Clearinghouse that's being housed by the National Center for Appropriate Technology. And that's being funded through the Department of Energy. So the Agri-Solar Clearinghouse just launched this month, and it will be a national research hub for case studies and research in agrivoltaics. What this could look like, we'll see. But this is, a set of photos of projects that are happening right now with regenerative sheep grazing, poultry, food production, and raised panels, where again we're seeing a real integration of approaches with solar and food and agriculture. So very excited to see more of this in New York and a spirit of innovation so that we can scale the solar that we need on our precious farmland in New York.
Thanks, Ethan. So great. Amazing stuff. Next up, we have Cullen, Howe, who is a senior attorney and renewable energy advocate at NRDC at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thanks, Cullen. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to be discussing solar kind of broadly from a state and federal perspective. And then I'm going to give a brief summary of some of the state regulations related to siting renewable projects on agricultural land. Much of this will probably be familiar to you if you know this space, but for folks who might be new to this area tonight, you might find some of this helpful. Just to sort of set the stage, this past year has demonstrated once again, if anyone needs reminding, that climate change is here and that these impacts are being felt today. Wildfires in the West, hurricanes in the South, increasingly severe weather events throughout the US. There is no part of our country or our state that will not be impacted by this. We don't know how bad things are going to get, but we do know that quickly reducing greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors of the economy is really critical to ensuring that these impacts will be minimized. To its credit, New York has recognized this urgency, and it passed the CLCPA 2 years ago that set out a roadmap for dramatically reducing emissions statewide. This law included requirements, as Jen had pointed out, that the electric sector reduce its emissions by 70% by 2030 and 100% by 2040. The law also established economy-wide greenhouse gas reductions of 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. Achieving these reductions economy-wide is going to be very challenging because it is very likely to require technology, at least in some sectors like heavy industry, that don't currently exist, or at least don't currently exist at scale today. The good news is that we know how to decarbonize the electric sector, and the better news is that we have the technology to do that, and the technology is getting cheaper every day. Because of improving and lower cost technologies, the cost of wind and solar has declined dramatically in recent years and now is much cheaper on a per megawatt basis than dirty forms of energy like coal and gas. So because we have the technology to decarbonize the power sector, and because this power has become cheap relative to other forms of electricity, the challenge has become how quickly we can scale up clean energy to hit these aggressive targets. On this note, as I'm sure that many folks on this call know, the state last year passed the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. It is a mouthful to say every time I say it, which among other things establishes the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, or ORES, and requires that the regulatory process for siting solar and wind be completed in 1 year. We are still in the early days concerning whether this process is going to work, but it does appear that this structure will speed up this process, which is great. At the federal level, and as Ethan mentioned, in September of this year, DOE set a target of solar providing 45% of US electricity needs by 2050. Just to put that in comparison, right now, solar provides about 3%. So to hit this target, we will have to install an average of 30 gigawatts of solar capacity per year between now and 2025, and then double that to 60 gigawatts per year from 2025 to 2030. Just to put that into perspective, last year in 2020, the total amount of solar installed was about 15 gigawatts. So we'd have to double that and then double that again. So NRDC's position is that distributed solar can and should be installed wherever it is cost effective to do so, including on residential homes and available locations in urban areas. DOE's analysis of how to reach this 2050 target includes deploying close to 200 gigawatts of rooftop solar, which is about 10 to 20% of that overall deployment. Although it does note that the technical potential of rooftop solar could be significantly higher than that. So even given this, much of the solar will need to be sited in areas where there is available land to install large-scale systems, which are typically 20 megawatts or larger. The DOE analysis finds that in order to hit this goal, approximately 0.5% of all surface area in the US will have to be used for solar. To put that into perspective, this is approximately the same amount of land that is currently being used for golf courses. Some of these projects can be sited on brownfields or other disturbed areas. And as most folks know, the state has a Build Ready program, which prioritizes the development of these projects on existing or abandoned commercial or former industrial sites. However, not all projects can go on disturbed land, and some projects can and will be sited on agricultural lands. And before I discuss that, I just want to briefly mention the role of agricultural generally in reducing emissions. Again, a lot of this will be familiar to folks on the call. This sector is responsible for about 10% of overall US emissions. Agricultural soils have the potential to sequester about 250 million metric tons of greenhouse gases annually. That's equivalent to about 65 coal-fired power plants. There are a number of ways to do this. I'll just mention a few very briefly. One is by incentivizing the use of cover crops. These are planted in between growing seasons and can include grasses, oats, wheat, soybeans, clover. Right now, about less than 10% of farmers use these, so we could certainly raise that amount. Another way to do this is by encouraging, regenerative agriculture, which has been mentioned. This can include reducing chemical fertilizers, using diverse crop and livestock rotations, incorporating compost and things like that. And finally, the two that we all know, one is to support organic farmers, which, by design, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Their practices sequester carbon in the soil, and it typically does not rely on energy-intensive chemical inputs. The other one that we can all do is reducing our food waste. Food waste generates about 3% of greenhouse gases in the US, and so we can all play our part by composting our organic waste and ensuring that it does not end up in the waste stream. So farms are obviously attractive locations to site solar installations because of their large areas, which obviously make ideal places to site some of these projects. And we've talked a few ways of doing this that are compatible with solar installations, like using land used for grazing animals or by agrovoltaics, which has been mentioned. I'm just going to briefly mention some of the ORES regulations governing the siting of large-scale renewable projects. And these are included in, when someone submits an application, these all need to be included in Exhibit 15 of the application. I'm not going to go over everything, and this is fairly technical, so I'm going to read it, but there are a number of things that need to be included. The first of those is an assessment of the land itself, including whether the project is included in a New York State certified agricultural district. Another requirement are maps showing the amount of land that's going to remain in agricultural use, as well as temporary or permanent impacts to production areas or areas that it's not feasible to continue farming. Another requirement is an agricultural plan that, to the maximum extent practicable, either avoids, minimizes, or mitigates agricultural impacts to active agricultural lands, which it's defined as active production in the last 3 to 5 years. Another requirement is a remediation plan to address inadvertent damages to surface or subsurface drainage. And finally, requirement for any agricultural co-utilization plan in cases where there will be livestock or similar types of agricultural uses that demonstrates that this use will be feasible. In instances where active agricultural land is permanently or temporarily impacted, an applicant is required to do 2 things. One thing is that it must construct the project consistent with the New York State Ag and Markets guidelines for mitigating construction of solar projects. And the second one is that they must hire an independent third-party monitor to oversee compliance. So I will stop there for now, but I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Cullen. Really appreciate it. All right, and finally, we have Giuseppina Agovino, who is a farm owner and the founder of the Flint Mine Solar Community, the community group. So thanks, Giuseppina. Take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. My name is Giuseppina Agovino, and I have with me Helen Meyer, and I am the president of Spencer Flint Mine Solar, and Helen here is the vice president. We are a group of advocates and landowners who came together in 2017 to advocate for a 100 megawatt solar project in the Hudson Valley. And I'm happy to announce that after a very, very long year in the Article 10 process, our project has finally gotten approval. So now we are in the process of subdividing lands and kind of putting things together. The developers are in the process of getting finance, buying the land, and moving forward. The project is not on prime farmland. It is mostly on abandoned dairy farms. And my farm is actually a sheep farm. And we have proposed solar grazing for our developers. Whether they take us up on the offer and use the opportunity to do it is still up in the air, but there's a lot of potential for solar grazing here. Helen, anything?
I think you have to prepare the people for a lot of pushback from the towns involved. They don't particularly want their beautiful farmland ruined, even though it's not beautiful, nor is it farmland. And
yes, it has been very difficult to kind of get the project going due to a lot of pushback on people afraid of losing their agricultural prime land, and having laws and having people speak out about preserving it and kind of having a dual use for it, solar grazing and whatever else we can do, I think is a great way to kind of get people on board. Our lands here have been impacted by climate change. A lot of us were doing hay and we're doing other uses, but unfortunately, because there's been such a rainy seasons for the past 2-3 years, none of the farmers can really make a living off their land because the land is just waterlogged. So we are losing our prime farmlands to climate change. So we do have to kind of come up with good solutions. We thank you guys.
Thank you both. Thanks so much and congratulations. And I hear you. I feel like your experience definitely tracks with organizing that I've done throughout the state. around organizing in rural communities and yeah, trying to kind of thread the needle of maintaining beautiful farmland, but actually keeping farmers on the land as well. So this is great. All right, so we did 50 minutes, and that means we have about 20 minutes of sort of discussion and question time. Usually the way that we do this is it's pretty relaxed. I have a list of questions that we've kind of gathered from the chat, which maybe I'll start with a couple, but anyone who wants to ask a question, you know, just raise your hand on Zoom. It's really easy to do.